Nasdaq. Joining us is Taylor Schreiner. He's director of Adobe Digital Insights to discuss Adobe's Digital Economic Index. Americans are used to things getting cheaper, but that trend may be ending and online commerce may never be the same. Taylor, before we get into the findings, tell us more about the index and the methodology.
Sure. Thanks, Jill. The Adobe Digital Economic Index is a modern, high-speed way of understanding how prices and other economic activity are happening online. We take billions of transactions, tens of millions of products, thousands and thousands of retailers, aggregate that data, and look at what's happening for consumers and retailers' lives online. So one of the great advantages of it is we take not only the prices we see, but the actual quantities that are purchased, and that gives us a really clear sense of how inflation and most of the time deflation is happening online. And we built this off of the work that we do every year for the past 7 years during our holiday season, where we look at overall US online retail economic progress and efforts. And that's been very successful for us. And we use the data then that we've collected and the models that we've built from that to model all of the economic activity that's going on in the US online. And so we launched that sort of at the end of March. It's something that we built without COVID-19 in mind, but it turns out to be an extremely useful tool for consumers, for companies, and for policymakers to understand how the online retail world is changing right now.
Let's talk about some of the findings in the index. With the burst in online shopping, you're actually seeing inflation in electronics, for example, which is kind of bucking the trend.
It was the most noticeable shift to us when we looked at our data, even though I think if you just look at the graphs, you might not pick it out immediately. We have seen for the past 7 years since Adobe started tracking pricing data in electronics in January of 2014, we've seen an almost constant downward trend of electronics prices, with the slight exception that every holiday season there's a little bit of a discount and then prices come back. And that's what we saw this year. But then as we got into February, March, and April now, we've seen consistent flat to slightly up electronics prices. And this is coming out of two coincident effects or causes. One is that obviously supply chains have been impacted all the way from manufacture to distribution for the electronics industry. And at the same time, we've seen consumers really shift what they're purchasing. So right now, for instance, I'm talking to you on a whole set of electronics that I wouldn't normally have purchased had we not had this pandemic. So there's that shift going on. And what's really, I think, interesting and important for people to understand about this is that electronics and computers have really driven deflation online for the past 7 years. And the real advantage that consumers have gotten from purchasing online has come from the extent to which they're purchasing those products online versus offline. And so if that changes, if it becomes the case that the offline and online worlds really start to merge there and there isn't really differentiation, it's going to change how consumers and retailers really think about that marketplace. And frankly, it's going to have to change how policymakers think a little bit about inflation, because that online deflation has been helping keep inflation down over the past almost decade.
That's an excellent point, considering all the stimulus that's being introduced into the marketplace as well. It was also a record month for apparel prices.
It was. Another surprising finding in the data, we saw a 12% decrease in apparel prices over the month of April. And that's 4 times what we would expect in the month of April, and it's much earlier of a decrease than we would have expected in that category. Most of the time we see online prices dip in the June-July timeframe, but we saw these happen very strongly in April. And obviously a lot is going on for the retail sector. Retailers are finding that they can't move their products through their normal brick and mortar stores as much, and so there's obviously a shift of that inventory into the online space, and that's changing the dynamics. But we're also seeing consumers increase their shopping and their spending on apparel very strongly in line with what we're seeing overall in terms of the shift to online, and also changing what they're buying, which I think is also driving a big portion of this shift in prices, because people are buying more pajamas. They're buying 2.5 times as much pajamas as they used to, but not jackets, because they're not going out or they're not going to their outside events as much. And so you're seeing those purchase behaviors really shift. Retailers are going to have to adapt for this coming retail cycle, this coming fashion cycle, and also they're going to have to think longer term about if we're getting a lot of shelter in place and people are staying home or social distancing, it's really going to change what people are buying, and we'll watch online as both retailers and consumers adapt to this new environment.
You also have to think about all the clothing that's been in stores for 2 to 3 weeks when we were in the middle of a season as it was mid-March, so that was kind of the end of winter, so you have all this winter apparel that's sitting there. It makes you think, what does that mean for the discounters? But another trend that you're seeing is buy online and pick up in store. That's certainly something that we have employed at my house, where you can order online and get it same day versus having to wait with increased shipping times.
Right. It's been we've had an eye on what we affectionately call BOPUS for the past few years. It's definitely been a significant trend in the industry. And but since the beginning of COVID-19, we've seen a tripling of BOPUS orders year over year in our data set. And so we're seeing people really shift the offline retail experience that they normally would have had into a buy online, pick up in store, or pick up curbside experience. And this has had a number of effects. I mean, one thing that it obviously means is that the question of what is an online purchase and what is an offline purchase becomes somewhat ambiguous as people are increasingly wanting to transact remotely with as little touch as possible, and your phone or your wireless device or your internet pre-purchase allows you to do that while actually going to a retail store and making that purchase. And as you say, consumers are also looking for that experience where they don't have to wait even that one day, and they don't have to have the ambiguity of, or they don't have to engage with a new brand, for instance. They can go to the brands that they trust and they're used to using to get the products that they want. And conversely, retailers that have these kind of footprints are able to pivot to buy online, pick up in store, are finding this to be a huge advantage in terms of continuing to engage their customers and also making use of that retail footprint as a sort of last mile distribution means of getting to their customers.
All right, Taylor, we have just about another minute here, but I want to wrap up with digital purchasing power of consumers. And not surprising, wine and spirit sales certainly surged.
Yes, so we track something we call digital purchasing power. So the extent to which your dollar is going farther than it did last year or 5 years ago, and we've seen that increase by about 4% year over year for the month of April, which means you're getting about 4 cents more for your dollar in terms of what you're buying online, and that's not unexpected. What's interesting about it are the things that we talked about just a second ago, that some of that's being driven by the fall in apparel prices and being offset by the lack of decline in electronics. But we're also seeing, as you point out, these other categories like wine and spirits, where we've seen a 75%, 74% increase in wine and spirit sales online between March and April, and that doesn't show any sign of abating.
All right, Taylor, thank you so much for the insight and for joining us on Trade Talks.
Thank you, Jill.
All right, and thanks for joining me. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.